Okay, so what cellular transport process is most responsible for helping pull water up a plant? Osmosis. Okay, so 1 mark for that. Where in the stem would you find the phloem? Okay, just beneath the surface on the outside, something that describes that it's not in the middle. Okay, that it's near the outside of the stem. Okay, that would be fine. Okay, what gases are stored in the spongy layer? Carbon dioxide is one. What's the other? Oxygen, 1 mark each. Okay, so that question's 2 marks there. Okay, what was the major advantage of multicellularity? We talked about this yesterday. It was one of the questions at the end of the lesson. Right, it overcame the surface area to volume ratio problem. It overcame the problem with diffusion, okay? Allowed things to get bigger, all right? Something along those lines, okay, is acceptable for an answer if they mentioned anything like that. Okay, if they mentioned overcame surface area to volume, or they mentioned facilitated diffusion somehow, or if they mentioned allowed things to get bigger, I'll even take that, okay? All right, number 5. What's the difference between a true multicellular organism and a colony of interdependent cells? 1-word answer. Specialization. I would also accept division of labor if they wrote that. Okay. All right, for number 6. What cells in the plant change their shape the most by changing the amount of water in their vacuoles? Guard cells. UA? I never spell guard right. It never looks right. Whether I put the U first or the A first, it never looks right. Okay. Number 7. The tubes that conduct water up a tree are called xylem. Yep. You know what, guys? For number 6, I'll take stomate, but I won't take it again after today. Okay? Because I did ask specifically for the cells that make up the stomate. I didn't ask for the structure. Okay? But I'll accept it today. Just in the future, know that if I ask for specific cells, I'm wanting the name of the cells. Okay? All right. And for number 8, 2 functions of the stem. Transport, support foliage. So transport and support would be our 2 functions. So if they have anything like transport and support, okay, or if they have like conduction and support, okay, something like that. 1 mark each for those functions. That makes the whole thing out of 10. So give them a mark out of 10. Let them see it. Put it in the box. Please double check your name is on it before you put it in the box. All right, so here's what we're going to be looking at today, guys. This stuff's going to be pretty straightforward, okay, because a lot of it is common sense. We're looking at the factors that affect plant growth, because tomorrow we're going to be doing an in-class activity where we're going to design a procedure that could be followed. We're not actually going to do it, okay, but you're going to design a procedure to test the effect of some variable on the growth of plants. So we're going to look at what some of those variables could be today, all right, so you've got some idea of what to do tomorrow. The main focus of tomorrow is to review the factors that affect plant growth, but also to review scientific method, and that is coming up with a good experiment that has, you know, 1 manipulated variable and 1 responding variable and some controlled variables and what kind of materials you would need. Just kind of going through the process again of how a lab works and designing a lab. And basically every unit we have 1 lab where you design the procedure yourself. Last unit that was the properties of compounds lab. Okay, so what you need to get out of today, the components that affect plant growth, the things that affect the growth of a plant, and how they do that. All right? Everybody with me there? Okay. Basic resources a plant needs. Let's make a list here. What are the basic resources a plant needs? Sunlight. Okay? Got to have that. Water. Yep. Carbon dioxide, right? Okay? Well, they can make their own, right? So yeah, yes, they need that resource, but it's not a raw material they have to have because they can produce it on their own. Okay. Soil, yes, okay, because in the soil are a bunch of things we tend to forget about that plants need because they can't make them for themselves, okay? And that would be essentially all the things that are like in fertilizer, all right? Nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, okay, and things like that, okay, that a plant needs because it doesn't consume food like we do. We get those things by consuming, you know, vegetables and things like that. We get nitrogen from proteins, okay, so eating things that contain protein, whether that's, you know, meat from an animal or whether it's, you know, legumes like beans and stuff like that, all right? But all of those things have to be present because a plant still needs to make essentially the same things that we do. Plants need to make proteins, right? Lignin is a protein, right? That's the thing that helps to make the stems hard, right? So that they can support foliage. You know, they've got to be able to make nucleic acids like DNA when their cells divide, and they've got to copy all of their chromosomes and everything. They've got to be able to make that stuff. They need nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus and things like that to do that. So they require these same resources. Okay? And you've probably seen plants that grow in poor soil tend to not do very well. Okay? Because those soils either don't have what they need or they've got too much of something in them, okay? Which is also not good for plants. All right. So we break up the things that a plant needs or that are in a plant's environment into two categories: abiotic components and biotic components. Abiotic components are essentially all the non-living parts of the ecosystem, so the raw materials that a plant would require: water, sunlight, carbon dioxide, minerals, soil, all of that kind of stuff. Those would all be considered the abiotic components because they're not alive. Right? There are other things within their environment that can affect them that are alive. Okay? For example, animals that eat them. Okay? That would be a biotic component that would be part of a plant's environment. And it would affect it negatively, obviously, if it got eaten. All right? So that would be a living thing. The decomposing organisms that live in the soil, bacteria and insects and things like that, that break down, you know, humus and decaying material and release the nutrients. Those would be a living thing that's a positive part of the plant's environment. Does everyone kind of follow? Okay, so abiotic means non-living, biotic means living. So there's two different categories into which things fall. All right, so again, looking at this picture here, we see those same resources we just talked about. Okay, we've got sunlight here. Okay, within the air, we've got carbon dioxide. Okay, we've got water. Okay, either in the form of rain, but it has to obviously get into the soil. The leaves can't absorb it because they're covered with what? With the waxy cuticle, right? Okay, the only way a plant gets water is to absorb it through its roots, unless it's a moss. Okay, mosses are different; they don't have a waxy cuticle. That's why they get dry and crunchy if you put them in the sun. Okay, they could absorb it through their well, they don't really have leaves, just through their tissue. Okay, but obviously water is part of that. Okay, we're looking in here. We see that there are some biotic components. Okay, that would be soil bacteria. Okay, soil, you know, decomposers. We've got the predator of grass. Okay? Grass has predators. Okay? If you were a cow, you're a predator of grass then. Okay? Grass is afraid of you. It just can't run away. All right? So yeah, there's things like that out there. Okay? You got food chains in here. Both of these things, however, can also contribute positively to the plant's environment. In what way? Yeah, they're waste. Okay? Both urine and feces both contain valuable nutrients for plants. I'm not saying you should go out there for plants. Okay? Don't eat them. All right? Yeah, so they would contribute material back, especially things that are partly digested and stuff like that. But the other part of this, something that we often don't think about, okay, is when a bird or other animal consumes fruit. When they do that, they usually also consume the what? The seeds. Okay? And that's actually the whole purpose of fruit. Okay, is to fruit is a seed dispersal mechanism. Either the fruit falls off the tree and rots on the ground, and when it does that, it releases the nutrients within it and essentially provides a growing medium for the seeds inside, or the fruit gets eaten. The advantage of having the fruit get eaten is that the seeds will be carried away to a new location and deposited on the ground in a nutrient-rich medium. one way or another, okay, they're getting put into a good medium in which to grow. All right, and this is how you see like little islands in the middle of the ocean that are hundreds of miles from anywhere else that have plants growing on them. Okay, the seeds don't swim out there, and nobody came out and planted trees. Okay, birds came along and pooped on them. Okay, that's how the seeds got there. Okay, transported by birds, right, to those islands, and then obviously then the plants will grow. Right. Okay, something we didn't mention. It's not a resource. It's part of the environment. It's a condition. Temperature. Okay, temperature is crucial. Plants, and to some extent animals, are not going to survive under certain temperature conditions. Okay? Plants in particular are not going to do well below freezing temperatures. Can some plants tolerate freezing temperatures for short periods? Yes. Okay? Can some tolerate them for long periods? Yes. Are they going to grow during the times of freezing temperatures? No. Okay? Well, you know, we've got spruce trees and things like that. They stay green all year, but they don't grow through the winter. They can't, because all the water is what? It's ice. Okay? Last time I checked, the xylem doesn't work for a solid. Okay? You can't transport ice up the xylem tubes. Okay? And water doesn't evaporate very well out of the stomates as a solid. Okay? So when there's no liquid water, we've got a problem. So temperature is important because it affects not only the ability of the plant to carry out its biological processes, okay, but it influences the availability of water. Okay? And water is, for most terrestrial plants, that's plants that live on land, water is usually their limiting factor. It's the thing that limits their growth the most, okay? The availability of water. Because if you live on land, most of the time sunlight's not a limiting factor unless you're in the bottom layer of the jungle, all right, where everything above you is shading you out. Okay, everybody with me on that? Right, so temperature obviously is a big factor. Okay, but water is essential to life, but its availability varies drastically among habitats. In the jungle, water's not a factor. Okay, water's everywhere in the jungle. Okay, it's flooded most of the time. In fact, water could be a detriment in some cases if we're talking about flooded conditions. If the roots are flooded, then we're not going to be able to get oxygen to the roots. They're not going to be able to carry out cellular respiration and break down sugars, and the plant will die. All right. Some plants can tolerate that, others can't. Okay, so obviously water can be good in the right quantities. It can be bad if there's too little or too much. Okay, so there's lots of little delicate kind of balancing acts for these resources. All right. Okay, questions on that so far? All right. Now, can plants maintain a body temperature? Can they control what temperature they are? No. Okay? They have no metabolism. Okay? The only group of organisms on Earth that can maintain their body temperature are mammals. Okay? There are no plants that can just go, oh, it's getting cold, I'm just going to heat up a little. Okay? I'm going to crank up my metabolism and get warmer. They can't do that. The plants are whatever temperature it is outside. Okay? In the same way that worms are whatever the temperature is outside. Fish are whatever the temperature of the water is. They can't control their body temperature through metabolic rate. They're not that complex. All right. Okay, sunlight. Okay, without sunlight, there's nothing. Okay, sunlight is the only source of energy for all ecosystems on Earth. Okay, because everything starts out with photosynthetic organisms. Okay, because they're the ones that can convert it to sugar. All right, so it drives everything. Most of the time, sunlight's not too big a factor. Okay, especially around here. All right, I mean, yes, it varies throughout the year. Here, I mean, in December, there's only 6 hours of sunlight, but at the same time, plants aren't doing very much in December. Okay? In the summertime, we've got 18 to 20 hours of sunlight. Okay, plants grow excessively during that time. Okay? The other part for light is that since the length of day changes throughout the year, it actually signals plants to carry out certain parts of their life cycle. All right. As days begin to start to shorten, plants will usually start to produce their flowers. Okay, so they tend to have flowers at kind of the longest amount of daylight, because during the longest part of daylight, okay, there's going to be the most insects available for moving their pollen from one flower to another, and that's how they produce fruit and seeds, etc. Right? So all of that stuff is influenced by how long the days are. Okay? Because a plant wants to be producing its fruit when there's a lot of energy available to make the sugar that's in the fruit. Okay? You need a lot of photosynthesis to make the sugar that's in a fruit. All right? So typically that's what goes on then. Okay? As the days begin to shorten, plants will start to signal that it's time to go dormant. Okay? Because as days shorten, temperatures are going to follow. Okay? They're going to go down in response to that. So, okay, length of day is what often cues a plant that comes back every year to begin getting ready for winter. That is, stop producing this stuff, lose your leaves, okay, things of that nature. So daylight, length of day, influences that. Length of day also influences the animals in the area. Okay, when geese are getting ready to fly south, okay, it's not because of temperature. Right? If it was because of temperature, they'd fly south the first time we get a little cold snap. Right? And that's not the way it works. They start to go south when the days start to get shorter. Right? And you know, for a lot of animals, mating seasons are cued by, okay, the days beginning to get longer. Right? Because they want to have their babies when the most food is going to be available for them. Right? So they want to have their litters kind of in late spring. Right? So short days usually cue mating behaviors, okay, for animals, so that their young are going to be born at a time when there'll be enough food to support them. That makes sense? Okay, these are just kind of logical things, okay, that are affected by those kind of things. All right. Wind. All right, you might think wind's not really a factor. Plants grow whether it's windy or not. Yeah, they do. Okay, but it influences how they grow. Right? If you go down further south than we are, okay, you go down to like Lethbridge and places like that, and you'll see that all the plants grow sideways. Not like totally sideways, but they're slanted a little bit. Always slanted towards the east, because it's always windy and the wind's always coming from the west, and they actually bend that way. Right? It's easier for them to maintain their height by growing slightly downwind, okay, and being stronger on one side than the other. Okay, plants up in high altitudes will grow in what's called the crummels form, and you can see here that this tree, okay, this tree right here, you can see the trunk and all the branches on this side. Okay, this is what we call a crummels form. If I was to draw that, okay, as kind of a side view, okay, the plant actually grows bent like this, and it only grows branches on this side. Okay, if I was looking down on it from the top, this would be the trunk, and there would only be branches here, and the wind direction is that way. By doing that, it protects its foliage. Okay? There's a bit of a windbreak created by the trunk. And so if it only grows stuff in the kind of the wind shadow, okay, that stuff never gets broken off or hit with abrasive ice, you know, that blows in the wind in the mountains, okay, things like that. And by growing like this, snow will get caught on this tree, pile up over it, and actually act as a bit of protection through the winter months as well. All right, so they tend to just adapt to their environment by changing their shape a little bit. Now, does growing like this affect how much foliage it has for photosynthesis? It does, okay, but it's going to live, right? It's just not going to be the tallest tree in the forest, right? But there's not really a forest around here either. You can see a lot of the stuff is stunted or dwarf, okay? It grows really close to the ground. So you tend to see a lot of dwarf type of plants growing in near the tree line. Right? Because they have to survive drifting snow, blowing snow, cold temperatures, etc. Now, the other thing with wind is it influences how much water evaporates. Okay? If that wasn't true, you wouldn't have a hairdryer. Okay? You just stand there and wait for your hair to dry. Your hairdryer dries your hair faster because it moves air past your hair. Right? And that means it's always bringing dry air to your hair. Right? And that's meaning it's going to dry more quickly. Wind will accentuate the effects of evaporation. When it's cold, that's called wind chill. Okay? We all know what that's like. Okay? You go outside on a windy day and it feels a lot colder than it really is. It may only be -10, but it feels like it's -30, okay? Because the wind's blowing 40 kilometers an hour. And as it blows past your skin, okay, it takes some of the moisture with it. And when water evaporates, okay, that takes energy, and it takes the energy from your skin. Your skin freezes more quickly. Right? So wind chill, okay, and the effects of wind can lead to dry or they can exacerbate the effect of cold. Okay, that means make it worse. Okay, that's what exacerbate means. All right, so wind can affect how much moisture is available. Wind's also important for plants because a lot of plants' seeds are transported by the wind. Their ability to reproduce and go places is affected by how well their seeds can be transported. Okay, like coming up here, probably in the next few weeks, we'll start getting that poplar fuzz that blows everywhere. Right? You guys know what that's, right? Like every May, that fuzz is kind of everywhere. Right? That's the seeds of the poplar tree. Right? They get caught on the wind, and the wind blows them to other places, and hopefully they grow. Okay? As a kid, you probably blew on the little dandelion things, right? And blew them everywhere, and did everyone a wonderful favor by planting more stupid dandelions in their lawn. Okay? I always tell my kids, don't touch that thing. I'm going to go spray it right now. Right? But again, those are seeds that are transported by wind. Okay? And lots of things are done that way, and lots of pollen is transported by wind. You can sometimes see it with spruce trees if you just happen to be watching them at the right time. Okay? A big gust of wind will come along against a spruce tree, and this little yellow cloud will come off of the tree. Right? And that's all the pollen coming off of that spruce tree being blown onto others, okay, which can then, of course, fertilize, okay, the eggs of a different tree, and that'll produce seeds. All right? Make no mistake, plants also have sperm and eggs. It seems weird, but they do. That's what's in pollen. Okay? What's in pollen is plant sperm. Right? And in other structures within either the flower or the cone, depending on what type of plant you have, okay, that's where the egg is stored. Okay? Inside of the flower, at the very base of a flower, that's the ovary of the flower. Okay? And in there is the egg, and when pollen lands on the top of the flower, okay, it creates a little reaction, and the sperm swims down and fertilizes the egg, and you get seeds. That sort of makes sense? I know it seems weird, but it's true. All right, rocks and soil. All the nutrients a plant gets have to come from the soil. If the soil is thick and rich, a plant does really well. If the soil is thin or poor or dry, then, okay, that's not the case. All right, this here, I took this picture up above the tree line, okay, in Kananaskis, and you can see here, what do you see a lot of? Rock. If there's rock near the surface, how deep do you suppose this soil is? Not very. All right. Really young soil always has rocks right at the surface. All right. A lot of them. In fact, in order to get that little garden trowel to stand up, there's actually a rock behind it that you can't see. All right. Because when I put it into the ground, I couldn't make it stand up because when I would stick it in the ground, it would hit the rock. Okay. That's how close to the surface the bedrock was in that place. So the soil was really only about an inch thick, which is why you don't see any big trees growing in this picture. You only see kind of little, types of grasses and scrubby kind of growth, right, that doesn't require deep soil in order to be successful. Right, so there's kind of a slow progression where the soil builds up. Okay, this stuff, how much water is it going to be able to hold? Not very much, right? There's just not that much soil there. If the wind begins to blow across this, that soil will be dry all the way down to the rock in a pretty short amount of time. Again, not that big a deal because it's only snow-free for maybe a month and a half, okay, of the year, because it's in the high alpine and snow will be covering it in short order anyway. Okay, so the physical structure and pH. pH is a big deal. Sometimes soil is really alkaline, that's basic, and sometimes it's really acidic, depending on where it is. Soils that tend to be submerged, okay, or partially flooded for parts of the year, they tend to be quite acidic. So if you have like an area around here where you have a slough, okay, and it kind of dries up in about mid to late August, that soil there is going to be saline, okay, it's going to have a lot of salt in it, and it's going to be somewhat acidic because it was covered with water, and all of the bacteria and whatever that were in there used up all the oxygen, and that leaves behind an acidic environment. Okay, so it's not going to be a place where plants really typically do very well, and that's typically what you see. Where there was a slough, you don't see much other than maybe cattails, okay, growing. Mineral composition is dependent on the rocks because soil is basically just decomposed rock. Right? The type of rocks you have in an area influence the type of soil you're going to have. Around here, our main kind of rock is sandstone. So our soil here tends to be very sandy, very gritty, and kind of a lighter brown color. If you go, further into the mountains where there's more limestone, the soils tend to be a lot finer, okay, and a little blacker, simply because the stuff that makes them up is a lot smaller in your fingers. Okay, if you pick up soil here and put it between your fingers like this, okay, you can feel the bits of sand and it's gritty. Right? If you go to a place where there's more limestone and you do that between your fingers, it almost feels like flour. Right? There's not many of the big kind of gritty pieces because the rock that soil came from is different. If you go to PEI, for example, how many people have been to PEI before? Okay, in PEI, their soil is really red. Okay, you can get these things called PEI dirt shirts. They take a white cotton shirt and they just put it in the red mud, and then it comes out this kind of reddish brown color. It's a tourist thing. Okay, but it's because the rocks in that area are very red in color. And so the soil tends to be red in color. You can sometimes even see that in roads. Okay, if you go to certain places in like, in tropical places, the pavement tends to be redder, right? Because the rocks and stuff that they're using to make up the pavement comes from the soil that's in the area, and it tends to assume the color of that soil. So the roads tend to be redder, okay, than they are up here. All right. Periodic disturbances. Obviously, things that come along from time to time can affect the growth of a plant. Okay? How often does a forest fire occur in an area? Not very often. No, a couple hundred years, maybe 100 years apart, something like that. But it certainly affects the plants that grow there. Typically, forest fires happen when a plant is, or when an area has been growing for quite a while. The plants are older, maybe they're sick, maybe they had pine beetle. Okay, that would also be a periodic disturbance, an insect infestation, right? The occurrence of tent caterpillars, right, would be a periodic disturbance. They tend to come on about a 7-year cycle, and you get a whole bunch of them, and they just decimate trees in an area. Okay, but a fire is probably the best example of a periodic disturbance because it does a couple of things. First off, it kills all the old growth. Okay, in doing that, it redistributes the resources. What's the first thing to grow after a forest fire? Yeah, grasses and fireweed, right? That's the reason it's called fireweed. It grows always right after a fire. Okay, those things are obviously right at ground level. They didn't grow before the fire because what couldn't get down there? Sunlight. Now that these plants are dead, the resources available at ground level are different. Now there's more sunlight available at ground level. Plus, a lot of the resources that were tied up in the trees are going to be released, over the next few years as these trees fall, decompose, break down, and release the nutrients that were in them. Okay. The other thing is that during a fire, fires are important. It's, for the longest time, Parks Canada and places like that were preventing them. If a forest fire started, the first thing they did was bring in all the fire crews and stop them from burning. They don't do that as much. Okay, they let them burn because it's important to renew the forest. Most of those trees, their cones will not open and release the new seeds until they've been burnt. All right, the cones are covered in a resin. I think we talked about this a little earlier, but okay, the cones are covered in this kind of waxy, oil-like resin, and that doesn't release the seeds until the environment around it gets hot enough to melt the resin. And when that happens, okay, the cone will expand, crack open, and the seeds will come out. Okay, now the reason they don't want to release the seeds until there's heat is because if they release the seeds when all those trees are alive, how will the sapling do? It won't do very well because it'll not get any sunlight. Okay? And it'll have to compete for water and minerals and all that with all these mature, strong trees. But if it releases it now, it's got full reign of all the available resources because these trees are all dead. Okay? And they're gonna shade it partially while it's little and vulnerable. Okay? And then as it grows, these are gonna fall down and it'll have, all the resources it needs. So it's, evolved to be a timing thing. Periodic disturbances help to renew the environment by redistributing things and allowing young stuff to grow in place of old stuff. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, so periodic disturbances are important. Floods are a periodic disturbance. Okay, when we had the big flood there a couple of years ago, and that brought in a lot of nutrients onto the floodplains. Okay, if you look at the floodplains now, they typically have a lot more kind of growth of grasses and little shrubs and things like that because all of that silt that came with the flood is full of nutrients. All right, and bacteria and things like that's why we don't want it in our houses, but it's good for the natural parts of the environment. Okay, so floods are important, periodic disturbances. They also bring in seeds from other places. Hurricanes, same thing. Okay, a hurricane comes along, it's going to break off older, sick, or dying trees, and they can be replaced by younger ones that were more flexible, and they'll grow up in place of them. Okay, tornadoes, you know, same idea. Okay, they'll take care of older deadfall and stuff like that by knocking it over. Okay, and that makes the sunlight more readily available. Okay, everyone follow? So periodic disturbances aren't all bad. There are some that are. A volcanic eruption would be, let's say, a very destructive periodic disturbance. All right, you know, Mount St. Helens, when it blew in back in what 1980 or whatever it was, okay, it completely destroyed the area surrounding Mount St. Helens. But that area now is really recovering because volcanic ash is very full of nutrients. All right, and so now that area is quite fertile. If you look at Italy, okay, all of that soil around in Italy and around the Mediterranean, okay, is all volcanic soil, and they grow, you know, all the grapes and olive trees and things like that in that area. Okay, it's very fertile. So they're important, but at the same time, they can be obviously pretty destructive in the short term. Volcanic eruptions like you have in Hawaii, those are a much more long-term destruction. Okay, because what comes out of the instead of ash, what comes out of the volcanoes in Hawaii? Lava, right? There's different kinds of eruptions. Mount St. Helens and the eruptions in Italy tend to be more ash and gas, whereas in Hawaii it tends to be liquid rock. Yeah, and when that comes out and solidifies, it's pretty hard for anything to grow. Okay, it's, you know, kind of a sterilizing, sealing it off, start over kind of a thing. Okay, and you can actually see this. Has anyone ever been to Hawaii and seen kind of the volcanic areas? You can actually drive up to some places where there's like actually flowing lava, right? And it's just you can't even fathom how intensely hot that is, right? And just how destructive that can be. All right, now those are all kind of abiotic factors. The biotic factors has to do with the living things and how they interact with the environment. Okay, if you've got, you know, little insects and things like that are breaking stuff down, they're eating dead material and releasing the nutrients, whatever, those are good things. But you can have things like carpenter ants that may not be so good, right? If they get into a older tree, they'll actually eat the tree from the inside, right? And they'll just devour it, and that'll kill it off, obviously. So that would be more of a negative environmental or biotic factor. Okay, how many people have ever come across carpenter ants before? Okay, they bite really hard. Okay, especially if your job is to cut down old trees. Okay, I used to work at a golf course, and we had to go and cut down the trees that were dead. And you get the chainsaw about halfway through a tree, and then you hit the nest, and the chainsaw sprays the ants all over you. Yeah, not cool. Very painful. Okay, and you get these raised bumps all over the place. Right. So carpenter ants, they'll destroy a tree from the inside because they crawl in, they make their nest in the middle, and that disrupts the xylem, and the tree can't transport water. Okay, so there are sort of maybe like parasitic organisms. These wouldn't necessarily be parasitic, but there are parasitic organisms that would live on the tree, and that could be, you know, detrimental to its health and things like that. So there's all kinds of living things that can affect, okay, the growth of a plant in an area, right? And some that are obviously that are going to help it positively, because a lot of insects are necessary for pollination. Bees, okay, things like that. They carry the pollen from one plant to another, and that's important, obviously, for their reproduction. Okay, just looking here, a couple of pictures here that kind of show the stuff we've been talking about. Okay, you've got within this stem here. Okay, you got the epidermis here, which is secreting the waxy cuticle on the outside, and then you've got inside of that what's called the vascular cylinder, and that's where the xylem, which is here in the middle. Okay, so this stuff here would all be kind of xylem tubes, and this red part here is the phloem. Right? And then kind of around that area is just part of the cortex, which is kind of a little bit of everything. All right, so all of that is around there. Okay, and you can kind of see that from the top a little bit better. Okay, when a root looks almost the same. Okay, when you look at it in cross section, which is what this is, but you can see that there's also these little root hairs where a lot of the absorption happens. Okay, there's a couple of ways that water gets in to the central part of the plant, to the xylem. It can either go in between all the cells, or it can go through each cell. There's advantages and disadvantages to each one. I don't think this part's actually in your notes, so if you're looking for it, I don't think it's actually in there. Okay. One way is faster than the other. Okay. Going in between all the cells is faster, because then you don't have to worry about the cell membrane slowing you down, taking nutrients out and things like that. Okay. The water just gets straight in, but it doesn't get cleaned either. Right? Any water that goes actually through the cells, the cell membranes will, filter out things or use some of the stuff, and the water that gets into the xylem then is a bit cleaner. If there were any poisons or anything in it, then obviously those don't get into the plant. Okay, or up to the leaves anyway. Okay, everyone kind of follow me there? Sorry, this is a better diagram. Okay, those two routes, okay, that I was talking about there. You got what's called the symplastic route. That's the one that actually goes through the cells and cleans the water. And there's the apoplastic route, okay, which goes in between the cells and doesn't get cleaned. Okay, gets into the xylem and then moves up the plant. All right, that part we'll skip, and that part we'll skip. Okay, different kinds of plants. Some plants, we said before, are very tolerant of excessive amounts of water, and some plants are not very tolerant of that. Some plants are very tolerant of dry or arid conditions, and some aren't. Okay, these plants here are what we call hydrophytes. Okay, hydro means what? Okay, and if you are something that is the suffix philic or phyte means you like it. Yeah. Okay, it means loving. That's okay, so if you're a something phile, you love that thing, right? Keep your mind out of the gutter. Okay? Everyone follow me on that? So hydrophytes are hydrophiles. They love water. Okay? So these plants are very tolerant of flooded. Now you're all getting it. It took you a minute. Wow, you guys are slow. Okay, these plants right here, okay, the ones that live in the jungle, they have to be tolerant of flooded conditions because they're flooded many months of the year. Okay, when I took this picture, this was actually during the dry season, okay, and you can actually see all of their roots. These roots here are just for anchoring. They just hold the plant in place. They actually don't have any absorption or absorptive ability at all. Okay, these roots right here that you can see almost coming out of the trunk of the tree, the locals called the snorkel roots, because what they do is they stay above the floodwaters. So when the flood is in full effect, the floodwaters can be like this high. So having these roots above the water level allowed the plant to get oxygen for the roots so that the tree could survive and not drown like trees would do if they were submerged for a short period of time. All right, everyone kind of follow me there? Now, to give you some idea, because it's hard to know scale looking at this, because I took the picture, I couldn't get into it, but hey, I'm 6 feet tall. That's where I would have come up to on that tree if I'd have been standing next to it. Yeah, so, I mean, those roots are like 2 meters off the ground, because sometimes the floodwaters are that high. Okay? And they have to have those snorkel roots out of the water. Right? So these are hydrophytes. They're plants that can tolerate and love flooded, overly wet conditions. Okay, a lily would also be an example of that. They grow right out of the water. Cattails are also a hydrophyte. Okay, you see them growing out of the sloughs and down here behind the football field and behind the track and those collection ponds, those retention ponds. Okay, you see cattails growing out of there. They can tolerate those kind of conditions. Okay. Okay, and then there's xerophytes. Xerophytes are the opposite. Okay, xerophytes have very thick cuticles. They have limited numbers of stomates. They may even have abbreviated or highly modified leaves. Okay, a cactus is an example of that. The leaves of a cactus are the thorns. They actually don't even carry out photosynthesis. They've adapted differently. Okay, and the photosynthesis is carried out here, okay, by the fleshy part of the cactus. Right? There's stomates on that, but there's a really thick cuticle, okay, really thick epidermal layer, and things like that that prevent a lot of evaporation. Okay, you can see that on this plant here too. It's got a really thick cuticle. One of those plants that we used in the transport lab, the one that had the kind of purplish red edges and the white center, right? That was that type of a plant. That's why it didn't work very well for our lab. Okay. All right, everyone, Follow me there? Okay, so these plants can tolerate really dry conditions. How many people have ever had a cactus? Okay, they're actually the hardest thing to keep alive. Everyone goes, oh, that person's terrible at keeping things alive. I'll give them a cactus because they won't be able to kill it. Okay, most people kill cactuses by doing what? Yeah, give them too much water. Like you basically never need to water a cactus. Right? Like you give it a drop of water a week and it'll be happy with you. Okay? But people are always like, ooh, gotta give it water. It's a plant. Yeah, you'll kill a cactus if you overwater it. Okay? They drown really easily. Okay? And that's what happens to most people when they have a cactus. Okay, so again, the cacti tend to be our xerophytes. Okay, they have different types of ways of carrying out their photosynthesis. Okay, they do the bulk of their photosynthesis, actually, the sugar producing part of it at night. They do the light collection part obviously during the day, okay, but they separate the two steps because the part that makes the water is the part that requires evaporation. So they do that at night so there's less evaporation, okay, and that obviously allows them to retain a lot more water. All right. Questions on any of that? All right. So we've got a little bit of time here.